1968, I already had my candidate. I was supporting Governor Ronald Reagan in his brief run for the Republican presidential nomination. I even had a Reagan for President button in my pocket. It would be 20 years before the import of Kennedy's speech began to eke back into my mind, and perhaps 20 more years before the issues he raised that day became clear to me. Bob Kennedy was contagiously eloquent that afternoon. He was polished. He was au courant. He reached out to the throng with an infectious sense of urgency. Yet, practically every word of that speech in the light of oncoming history was wrong. Moreover, the speech, as good as it seemed to be in 1968, quickly and unaccountably faded from my mind. And 20 years later, its sense of urgency had vanished too. Weeks later, when bullets announced the tragic denouement of his quest for the presidency, I had put, for the most part, his April speech out of my mind. Life then took off for me. The growth of my magazine and all the adventures that came with it crowded out other thoughts. Suddenly, the years of student protests were upon us, and the race riots and the assassinations and Watergate and all the hullabaloo that went with it, some transient, some still with us. The Nixon years arrived in typical Republican sobriety, but culminated in tragedy. Then there was the Ford interlude, and more Republican sobriety. And then the delightful Carter years, when I was given my first chance to bedevil the president, and never missed an opportunity to do so. Years later, President Carter's aide, Robert Pastor, assured me during a junket to Mexico City for President Miguel de la Madrid's inauguration, "Carter hated you." Wow! My first presidential endorsement! Then the years with Ronald Reagan in the White House, schmoozing with him, dining in the state dining room, and inviting him to my home for dinner. He and a security detail composed of hundreds, plus his own bartender. He drank screwdrivers. 2. Then came the first Bush years. Luncheon in the Rose Garden, where I counseled him not to raise taxes. Bush was a gent, even if he ignored my counsel, and that of Chief of Staff John Sununu, and an advisor, Charlie Black. After President George H.W. Bush came the rollicking Clinton years, a descent from the greatest generation to the phoniest generation. That is to say, the coat and tie radicals of the 1960s generation. Bill never had me to dinner, though we shared a dining room once at the Jockey Club in Washington in 1995, where we chatted until I noticed that he was becoming agitated. His wife, too, was becoming agitated. I suggested he go over and sit down, and he did. The President of the United States sat down at my command. We never renewed the conversation. Yet, I never stopped pursuing him and his lovely wife, Bruno, through the 1990s, through the next 2 decades, even through the #MeToo hysteria, when he was lying low. Then came another Bush, George W. Not quite the gent that his dad was, but he did have me into the White House for dinner with the prince. That would be Prince Charles, not the entertainer prince. Then the years of Barack H. Obama, a Swenya cipher. And finally, my 2016 pick for president, Donald Trump. I spotted him when he came to the American Spectator's 2013 gala, and picked him to win the presidency about the time he first came down the escalator at Trump Tower. I repeated my pick frequently right up to his election. Happy days are here again. Or were they? On and on for over 50 years, the world whirled and clanged. At times, it picked up speed. Occasionally, it slowed down. But usually, it